Hey everybody, it's Tom Mason, and welcome back to another sculpting video. I feel like we've been working on hands for a while now, and I know there is a third part, the open hand, that I said I was going to do, but I wanted to take a little break from that just to show a different element. So, right here we have, I'm going to be sculpting kind of a jagged spear element, and what I'm doing here, I start out with a brass rod and cut it down with the snips. And then what I'm doing here is I'm pinching it with a large set of flat nose pliers. And that gives it a nice flat surface, and that will help it from kind of pull it. Well, two reasons. One, it keeps the wire a little bit thinner when you're making a blade. And two, it helps the wire not come out of the putty. As you can see here, I'm starting to create the mix that I like to use when I'm sculpting weapons. You can use Greenstuff or ProCreate, either works. Then I like to add in about 50%, so 50-50, of Aves Epoxy Sculpt, and this is a great material. I don't like using it by itself, but once mixed with one of the other two putties, it has more substance to it. It feels very similar to the putty you're used to, but then it can also be filed. It becomes rock hard. I almost forgot what I was doing here when I saw myself pick up these tiles, but I like to use these. These are just little samples of ceramic tile. And what I was doing here is I was spreading some Vaseline on them to make them nice and slippery to help the putty not stick. So what you do here is once you have your putty all mixed up, you press it around the wire, trying to keep it, trying to keep it oriented so the flat side, the flat part of the wire stays kind of in the direction that the blade would be going. And then you end up putting it on these plates and slowly massaging it down, making it thinner and thinner, helping spread the putty out, as you can see here, until you get basically to the thickness that you're looking for. It's okay to leave it a little bit thicker because you can always file it down, but the more you do here, the less you have to do later. Now here you'll see I'm kind of pre-shaping the sword, or well, spear in this case. Normally I don't do this, especially if it's just a straight sword. I just put it the putty on in a nice tubular fashion, massage it down, and I basically just file it into place afterwards or cut it down. But here, because there's a pretty distinct shape and it's very asymmetrical, it's a good idea to try and just give yourself some visual cues and of where the blade itself, the kind of shape it'll have, and that way if the wire ends up poking out, you can readjust. Alright, as you saw, I took a break to cure this piece, put it in a putty oven. I like to cure this mixture for at least an hour, and then you need to have it, you really want it to completely cool before you start in on shaping it. I do a little bit of trimming here with the scalpel before moving on to the files, but most of my shaping is done this way. Again, if you have a lot of excess, it's good to use some snips or the Scalpel or X-Acto blade as you saw, but I did a pretty good job of getting the basic shape done before I even started to file and everything. This part can be very time consuming. You're trying to get a profile just right, but on top of that you need to constantly look down the length of the weapon, because as you're filing, at least for me, I have a tendency to lean the file further to one direction, which can create a slant, so you're not getting a nice squared off 90-degree angles all the way around the sword. So you need to constantly be checking that. I also probably should have done just a little bit more trimming here. I ended up doing a lot with the file, as you'll see, but I really like the result that you'll see at the very end, but it did end up taking me a little longer than probably should have. I also ended up taking a significant amount of time to try and get the right thickness for the blade. It ended up being a little too thick when I originally had pressed it, so I spent quite a bit of time filing the side coming up here. Alright, I finally got it down to size. I think in the end it was probably around 2 millimeters thick overall. You can go a little thinner than that, but you always have to be a little careful when you start getting that thin, as stuff can have trouble casting, or more importantly, it's just very fragile. And now I moved on to starting to work out the shape a little more again, using the X-Acto blade, or rather the Scalpel, and just bringing in the file again, trying to find that shape. Again, don't forget to check down the length of the piece from time to time, just to make sure that you're keeping the edges perpendicular to one another. Alright, at this point I almost have it right. I'm just doing some last minute refinements. You can probably see why I love sculpting weapons so much. It's just so fun going back and forth, tediously refining these shapes. Alright, I'm finally almost done with this part here. I went ahead and chopped out a bunch of this because it was very redundant, but I tried to leave in a good sampling of where I filed and kind of how I looked around the piece while I was doing it. But now we're on to the good stuff. This is where we get, in just a second here, we're going to start putting in the edge of the blade. Now for this part I use any flat file. I typically use the largest one I can just to cover as much area as possible. And I start by getting my filing at a roughly 45-degree angle to the corner where the blade will be. And that's just so that I can bring the blade down to the midpoint. So you need to do it on two sides, obviously, if it's a sword or a spear in this case. We'll just start with this. So what I mean by to the middle is, so you're filing along the long edge that would not be the blade, right? Not be the edge of the blade, I should say. And you're trying to bring the edge point to the middle area of the width of the weapon. Whew, I don't know if that was the best way to say that, but I think I got it out. You need to do that on both sides, and I like to try and get as close as possible on one side and then flip to the other, and then you can slowly refine it. But once you get kind of a general 45-degree angle, then I go back in and I start to steepen the angle so that you're not filing on the middle edge point anymore, and you're just kind of bringing the slope more towards the center or towards the inside of the blade, the non-edge part. Gosh, I hope this makes sense. The way I did this spear is very similar to the way you do a double-edged sword or something. I basically, there's a blade edge on either side. So you basically just repeat it on either side of the weapon, just gradually. This one's a little tricky because it has some concave curves kind of on the back side of the blade, which can be a little bit tricky to line up. But once you have the major slopes worked in, you can use a rounded file on those parts especially. It can be very helpful. And as you can see here, once I get the main filing done, I will go back, as I'm doing right now, going back to file, but sometimes it can become a little difficult to see exactly what you're doing, or maybe you're not holding the file at a perfect angle when you're filing, and it can make some of those sharp edges look a little soft, a little rounded. So by taking the X-Acto blade or a scalpel and just dragging it across right here, you can really start to define those edges. It's a lot easier to control what's being scraped away. Alright, so there you have it. There's the finished spearhead. After that you can work on sculpting a handle or a shaft to the weapon depending on what it is, but I'll cover that in another video. Alright, hope you enjoyed. Like, leave a comment, feel free to ask any questions, and yeah, keep sculpting.